Dr. Sharma and distinguished people on the dais, uh, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here because this is an area in which I think there are issues that need to be clarified in some sense. The whole idea of net zero is very straightforward, that people felt that if their emissions by a certain date become zero, then there will be no addition to the stock of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that is the one that determines global warming. So it is not just what you emit every year, but what is the stock of carbon dioxide or GHGs in the atmosphere that determines your global warming or the state of warming. So what is really troublesome about net zero notion is that even if OECD countries and many others attain the target by net zero, by 2050, the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would have gone up. And that means the warming would continue even when you are not adding any substantial amount to the atmosphere of greenhouse gases every year. So what should have been the correct measure for having is not only that you declare your net zero target year, by which date you want to have net zero, but you should also declare that you are going to minimize the emissions from here to there over this period. So if everybody is asked to minimize their emissions, that would be the correct way of looking at net zero issues. Now, India's responsibility is, as we have been saying time and again, that India is a very small contributor to the global stock of greenhouse gases, and that our emissions, at least on a per capita basis, are lower than the world average, and yet we are highly vulnerable. And we have seen that not only India, but the whole world is suffering from the amount of extreme events and the frequency and the intensity of extreme events that we are all witnessing due to increase that is already taking place, the warming that is already taking place. So climate change is not something that is going to happen 50 years down the line. It's happening now, and we are all paying for it. So obviously we have, though not responsible, we still have a great interest in seeing that the world gets to a small stock of global greenhouse gases and not keep on increasing it. Now, how can we do this? One way would be to do is that people should really bear, as you know, in the Rio conference, the climate change agreement was that countries should do differentiated responsibility should be there, and countries should take actions on the basis of their own capacity as well as their responsibility. Now, if you look at global warming from this point of view, what is the responsibility of different countries? One would argue that from 1990 onwards, nobody can claim that there is no danger of global warming or climate change, because the preparations for the Rio Conference of 1992 Earth Summit started in 1990. That means all countries were aware that this is the problem, and they should take responsible action about that. So if you consider the stock of emissions a country has made is a measure of its contribution or responsibility to global warming, then we should really tax, not carbon tax, but a tax of the stock of carbon that they have put in the atmosphere. The advantage of doing that would be that countries would have a responsibility and its own interest to cut down their emissions or postpone their emissions as much as possible, and that they should really encourage them to do negative emissions. But that is one aspect. What should India do in terms of reaching its net zero? just from a technical point of view, today really solar and wind renewable costs have come down dramatically. Battery costs are coming down. We also have possibilities of off-river hydro plants, which can be really, will cost only half as much as a normal hydro plant, and that it can be constructed in half the time, and so on. So there are possibilities for us to balance the renewable power. And therefore, I think certainly technologically it will be possible to go to renewable technology and reduce our things as soon as possible. However, one has to recognize that large part of India's power sector is dependent on coal. Millions of people are employed in the coal industry. And we cannot really say that we'll suddenly cut down coal. Even at Glasgow Summit conference, countries were arguing that coal should be phased out, whereas the concentration, the emphasis should have been on fossil fuels, because the emissions made by the burning of oil and gas is 3.5 times the emissions made by the burning of coal. So certainly, India should have not objected to phasing down of coal, but this should say phasing down of all fossil fuels would have been the correct and more logical step for us to take. But that is water down the drain, I mean, down the river, and nothing much we can do about it at this stage. But because coal is such an important element of India's power sector, and because millions of people are employed in the coal industry, we should really continue to use coal, maybe not enlarge its use, but certainly continue to use at more or less the same level, because then the employment would be preserved and maintained. And to do that, that means carbon capture and storage becomes an extremely important element for us. Now, carbon capture and storage, but carbon capture and use can also be an important element of this. I think it is possible for India to devise or find storage spaces for carbon capture. At least that will give us some breathing space for phasing down or a coal. The other important element here is hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is useful because there are many sectors in which electricity substitution is not easily possible, and that what are known as in the literature, and generally we talk about hard to abate sectors. And among the hard to abate sectors are steel, and steel is an important element for India. Today we are consuming something like 58 million tons of coking coal. And that can be replaced actually by hydrogen if you push the technology and make the investment necessary for doing that. Using hydrogen at steel plants would also be somewhat easier, because the plant itself, you can set up the hydrogen plant at the steel plant itself, so that the question of storage and transport of hydrogen can be easily overcome for certain uses. Similarly, I think heavy-duty vehicles, one thinks that hydrogen may be a useful thing, though there are issues there of distribution and storage and the tank size and so on. A kilogram of hydrogen has the same as some 4 times the energy of a kilogram of gasoline. So you have to recognize that it's a very concentrated thing. At the same time, however, the weight distribution is so small that a liter of hydrogen would have maybe 1/10 the energy of a liter of gasoline. So the amount of storage that you need for a truck and the pressure under which that tank should be there, and the possible risk of accident and so on, has to be factored in before we think that this is a good solution for this. And there are many other areas like airplanes, international shipping, where hydrogen can play an important role because you can store this in a sufficiently large amount of space. So I think essentially the conference is focusing on these two main issues, CCS and hydrogen. And I think these are important issues for India to deliberate and see what is it that we can do and where we can do. But there is one more question that we should ask ourselves. It is not just that technology is available, so solar cost of coming down and so on, but the fact that to replace 1 kilowatt of coal capacity, we need to invest in 4 kilowatt of solar capacity. So the upfront investment required in solar or renewables would be 4 to 6 times the upfront investment required in coal. So we will need climate finance. It's not that we won't aid in some sense, but we would certainly need, the world should provide long-term, low-interest climate finance. And that is a critical element if many developing countries are going to do that. Because if we don't get this, then there will be no incentive for companies in India to go with a high interest rate for borrowing cost to go for many renewables, unless maybe on the margin there will be few and so on. But I think we should really argue at the international level that net zero is not enough. You must minimize your stock of emissions, your total integrated emissions from now to net zero target date. That should be your commitment, should be there. And that you should also commit to provide climate finance that is long-term, low-interest finance. Thank you very much.